Black Gemara, with Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph. Yesterday's Gemara was quite involved and quite lumdish. Taisus, I didn't talk about it, but Taisus has an interesting chakira. You don't normally have Taisus with chakira. Taisus has an interesting question. He's inquisitive. What happens if you have two tvachim of paslas chach, two tvachim of open space, and then two tvachim of paslas chach? Now we have a concept or principle called lovud. So does that combine the two sets of two tvachim of paslas chach and renders a sukkah pasal now or not? In other words, the question is, lovud means that it's as if it's filled. Filled with what? Is it as if it's filled with kosher chach? That's the law of lovud. In the kosher sukkah, we imagine, or all lovud does is it pulls whatever is next to it and pulls it, drags it across in the area to also cover the area that it's open space. Because if it pulls, then it's pulling paslas chach together, makes it puzzle. But if it's as if it's filled with kosher chach, then obviously it's separating the two, piles of two tvachim chach, and therefore it's kosher. He remains with a question mark. It's an interesting chakir of Taisus. Okay, we're up to Gemara Amar Abaye. It's about 8 or 9 lines on the top of the page. So, okay, Amar Abaye. Now we're going to talk about Lavud. Amar Abaye. Abaye says, Avir Shloisha. If you have an open space, the Sukah Gedola in a large Sukkah, right? So it's going from one end to another end. Umiyate, but then you reduce that open space. How do you reduce it? Either with kosher schach, bein bekanim, you use normal sticks or poles, so therefore you use kosher schach, or bein bishpudim, you used spits, which are kalim, which are pasal schach. So the law is having meat. I don't care whether it's kosher schach or whether it's or non-kosher schach. The fact is you reduced the avir. It's no longer 3 tvachim of open space. However, what about the sukkah tana? When it comes to a small sukkah, where there the problem is not only the fact that it's pasal chach, the problem also is you have to make sure that you have 7 tvachim of kosher sukkah. So then we'll say this big kanim, if you use kosher sticks, having meal, it's kosher. Why? Because it's less than you have. It's we say lavud, and therefore you have a kosher sukkah. But bishpudin, but if you put in there shpudin. If we put in there full paslas chach, loy have a mir that's no longer considered a mir. Why? Even though now you no longer have 3 tvachim of open space, nor do you have 4 tvachim of paslas chach, but the fact is you have 3 tvachim together. That therefore does not allow you to have. You don't have enough kosher chach to make a kosher sukkah. So therefore, it's considered 3 tvachim of a non schach. And therefore, you're missing out on the 7 tvachim, and that's what makes it possible. There's a machlekes nachronim where we say that is a gap of, let's say, 2 tvachim that is kosher. Rashi says, why is it kosher? Because of lavud. Others say it's not because of lavud, just because the law is that less than 3 tvachim doesn't pass the sukkah. So, and it has some ramifications as well. Anyway, it says it more further. When are we all saying that if you have space less than 3 tvachim, does not render a sukkah pasal minatzad if it's let's say next to the wall. So we say lavud. But let's say you have open space in middle, not next to a wall. In middle, there'll be an argument whether you say lavud or not. Pligi bar Rav Acha Ravina. There's an argument between Rav Acha Ravina as to whether we say lavud in the middle of a sukkah. So one of them says, why not? There's lavud in the middle of a sukkah as well. And another one says, ain lavud be'emtza. There is no lavud in middle of a sukkah. There's no lavud in the middle of a sukkah. It's only when it's next to a wall do we say the law of lavud. The Gemara will explain. Says the Gemara, like as follows. Yeah. What do you call it? So what's the proof or what's the reason why he said there is love in the middle sukkah? He said, look, I see a precedent. I see by Erev. We learned it. The time we learned koida. By an Erev, we have three walls, and then you have the fourth side. You have to put a beam across, and so therefore that's a heker, or some say it's a mechitza. It reminds you that here the street ends and the side street ends, and now you're going into the main street. So what happens if you don't have a beam going from wall to wall, but you have a half a beam protruding from one side, another half a beam protruding from the other side of the wall? And as long as they come together within 3 tvachim, we say it's like one long beam as kosher. So we say love it even in the middle. If a koida goes out of this wall, it doesn't reach the other side. Two beams. One goes out from one beam, wall, one comes out from the other wall. If they're not touching each other, if it's less than 3 tvachim, you don't need another beam. We'll say it's one long beam. Shloisha, if the gap between the two beams is wider than 3 tvachim, so there's no lavud, then you need another beam that goes from wall to wall, straddles both walls. So what do we see clearly from here? That there is lavud right in the middle. Clearly from here. Remember, we're talking about over here a sukkah where the avir goes from one end of the sukkah to the other end, so it's dividing or segregating the sukkah into 2 parts. If you have a small section with holes, you have holes or gaps in the middle of the sukkah, that's not a problem. And Tosfos explains that the front part of the sukkah is kosher, and automatically the rest of the sukkah is kosher. Tosfos has 2 views. Either you need beyond the gap to the 3 walls that you have kosher as chachar, and the entire sukkah becomes kosher, or you can even if between the gap and the wall is less than 7 tvachim, you can count in the other side of the gap to make up your 7 tvachim. The other one says, don't bring a proof from Erev. Shiny Kodesh Rabbanan. The whole idea of Erev is only with Rabbanan as a reminder. So we're very lenient. So we were very relaxed in the laws. We said, okay, you can have a beam that doesn't really meet each other. My time with the mandam and ain't love them. So what's the basis? The one said there's no love in the middle of the room. But none. In the laws of Tumah. We learned by Tumah, we learned before that if you have a roof, anything that shares the same roof comes Tumah. The roof is a transporter, a conduit for Truma, a conductor for Truma. So if you have one end of the room Tumah, another room Toy, it spreads the Tumah around. But if there are, let's say, if there's a big gap in the wall, in the ceiling, and the tumah is right underneath that gap, then the tumah goes up to Shemaim, and the roof is not covering it, doesn't hover over it. So therefore, if that was tumah, it doesn't spread anywhere. If anything else is tumah, it doesn't reach this particular item because it's not sharing the same roof. So the Mishnah here makes a difference between whether the roof has an opening of a tefach or the roof has an opening of less than a tefach. But as far as the rules I just told you, it makes absolutely no difference. It has other ramifications where Rashi says and Tosfos says we don't bring it down over here. It's clear from the way Tosfos reads over here that a lot of the Rashis we have they didn't have, because Tosfos here is verbatim of Rashi and doesn't associate with Rashi. And there's a few times where Tosfos is doing that here in this Masechta. So it seems that, and I quoted you yesterday another time that they quote Rashi, which we don't have. So it seems in Masechta Sukkah they seem to have had another Rashi than what we have here today. Now we learned, or at least some of the Rashis. Now we learned Aruba Shebabayis. We have a sky window up in the roof of Tefach, an opening of a Tefach. Tumah Babayis. If there's Tumah somewhere underneath the roof of the house, Kulei Tomei, everything under that roof shares that Tumah, except Masha Keneged Aruba Torah. Anything which is directly underneath that skylight is Torah. Tumah Keneged Aruba. Let's say whatever is Tumah is placed right directly beneath the skylight. Kolabayis Kula Torah. The entire house is Torah. The entire house is tired because there's no roof on top of the tummy that you want it to spread. Now the Mishnah said, what about ein baruba pesach tefach? Let's say the window does not have a tefach. And the truth of the matter is, regarding the laws we just said a minute ago, it makes absolutely no difference. Tumah bayi is keneged aruba tired. Tumah the house opposite the window is tired, and tumah keneged aruba. Why? Because there's an opening there, so it's not sharing the same roof. And Torah, Tumah Keneged, Aruba Torah, Tumah Keneged Aruba, the Tumah, let's say, is directly underneath the Aruba, then, what do you call it? Kolabai is Kula Torah, the whole house is Torah. What do we see from all this? The skylight is only a tefach, or less than a tefach, makes no difference. We don't say lavud, imagine that it's closed and anything underneath the skylight should become tummy as well. No, if we follow the rules of tefach, of lavud, which means you imagine that it's closed off, so it's under sharing the same roof as everything else around it. Why does the Mishnah say over here that anything directly beneath that skylight, whether it's a tefach or less than a tefach, does not share the same roof? Doesn't that prove there's no lavud in the middle of a room? That's my basis. The Lama says they cannot bring a proof from here. Shiny Hilchos Tum, the laws of Tum are different. The laws of Tum is Allah Moshe Sinai, and therefore you can't equate and draw inferences from here and draw parallels to other places as well. because we rule halacha Sinai is only unique to that particular halacha, and you cannot draw any parallels whatsoever. Saying about a further daughter, this whole discussion we had before, in fact, was also about whether in the middle of a sukkah it's 4 amas or 4 tvachim. Daughter Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi, Bar Eloi made a drasha, and he was very vague. He said, "Bayis shenifchas," a house where the roof collapsed, it was opened up. The sichech al gabel and placed it with kosher schach. Shade is kosher. Doesn't say, anything about it. How far? What about the walls? Does it have to be near the walls, far from the walls? Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yesi, said, "Rebbe, Padish, Rebbe, you got to explain. Be more specific." Kach Pirish Abba, my father Rabbi Yesi explained as follows: Arba amas, if it's distant from the walls, more than 4 amas, greater than 4 amas, so it's possible. Where are your walls? Pachas my amas, if it's less than 4 amas from the wall, then shade it's kosher. That's number one, which he wasn't specific. Talking about things which he wasn't specific, and Rabbi Shmuel had to explain in the name of his father. We bring another few examples. There's a fish called abruma. It's very small, and the problem is with the fish, because it's so small, you might have other fish which are not kosher, or might have other things, creeper crawler, that are not kosher in there and maybe not noticeable. Yet he says, "Shai permitted to eat it." That's what he said. Open-ended statement. Rabbi Yesi, son of Rabbi Shmuel, said to him, "Rebbe Padish, you got to be more specific. Depends where this particular fish is coming from which rivers you caught it. If you caught it from that particular place, asur. There it's forbidden. Why? Because it does have not kosher fish attached to it, or has all these parasites which are not kosher. And because they're so tiny, they're macroscopic, you can't see them. Therefore, we don't want you to fish. Shmuel complained. They come from another place. Mutelas, they're permitted. Why? Because in that river, they don't have this kind of parasites. Abai said something similar. There's a certain fish called tzachanta. If it comes from the Bab, if it comes from the city of Bab Nahara, the name of a river called Bab, in the Bab Nahara, the river called Bab, then Sharia, it is permitted. There's nothing non-kosher floating there. My time, and Moshe wants to know why. Why is it that in that particular river, this fish is kosher? Because there's rapids, there's very strong water, and we know that treifa fish, kosher fish, can swim against the tide because they have a backbone, they have a vertebrae, and therefore they can swim against the tide. A non-kosher fish cannot swim against the tide. The high dog tame, even less if the shed doesn't have a spine. Loy motzi koyim cannot exist in place where there are rapids. How can it be? We see the koy. We see plenty of times that there are fish in that river that even though they're not kosher fish, they can survive there. The melichma isn't because it's salt water. It's not a freshwater river; it's a salt water. And the high dog tummy in this non-kosher fish, even the less like kilfe, because it has no scales, lemotzikoi cannot exist in that. This particular fish, it's small, whatever it is, so it's vulnerable. It cannot exist in salt water. Like we see clearly that there is such fish can. We see fish that are in other rivers where there are rapids, with strong currents, and where there's salt water, and yet it's not kosher fish. Small ones can exist. Because in the sand at the bottom of the river, you don't find this non-kosher fish. And that's the reason why we're not worried in that area. If you pick up fish, we'll assume straight away it's kosher. Amar Avinu said that was then. But even today, the Shavchi Nor, they diverted certain rivers into that river. So they took the Nor Asan and the Nor Gamda, and they diverted Lahasam to there. A city, it's all Asr. Wherever these rivers are, maybe they're in bubble, they all become Asr. Says the Gemara, let's get back to Sukkah. In the Mishnah, we talk about a case of an Aksadr. One of the cases we talk about today from the Kummi is they have a number of houses shaped like a ches. And then in front of each house is a veranda, a porch. They all have roofs, and these roofs are all not kosher for schach only, not because the material is not kosher, it's because they were built for a house. They were not built for a sukkah, for shade or anything else. It was built for a house. And therefore it's aser either because it says in pasuk sukkah, v'loy bayis, and not a house, or because of tas, v'loy mina aser, like the Ritva learns. And actually Rashi says that before as well, which everyone wonders why, because Rashi always says the reason is because sukkah will bias. But here, punkt over here, in this Mishnah, yesterday we learned, he says, Tasar Leiminos. They try to explain that. So, and we learned there that you're using the walls of the house as the walls for the sukkah. What you did was you covered the entire chutzah with schach, And we said that if the walls of the house are within 4 amos, because these roofs on top of these verandas are not kosher. But if if the walls of the house are within 4 amos of the central chutzner, then no problem. Everything is kosher. Says the Gemara. That's what we learned before about Eat what we learned. Let's say you placed schach on top of a sukkah. Sheyesh lo ptzimim. The sukkah has a bunch of beams. Now we learn like Rashi, Katesis, and others completely disagree. But Rashi learned. Let's say you have a sukkah with beams. Every 3 tefachim you have a beam alongside the sukkah. Now, let's say we're talking about a case where, let's say, the roof of the veranda is wider or greater than 4 amos, which means you no longer can use the walls of the houses as your walls. So he say, yeah, but what happens if the forefront of these porches or these verandas, they are beams, pillars, and if these pillars are less than 3 tefachim,
these posts support the achsadre.
Yeah, whether it does or doesn't make no difference. The fact is that they're there. If they're less than 3 tefachim apart from each other, then we say it's lavud and it's kosher. Because remember, when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, we have a rule: you cannot have parah to Rub Ma'imid. But when it comes to Sukkah, it doesn't matter. Because remember, we have 2 walls on a tefach. Even if one of those walls has a door or something or gaps, it doesn't make a difference. So here also, you have all your walls are basically these posts, as you just said. And if they are all less than 3 tefachim from each other, we'll apply the rule of lavud. You have proper walls around your sukkah, 3 walls around your sukkah. That's what Abaye says. And Rava says psul. Rava says the sukkah is pasul. Abaye is kosher simply. Amrina, we say pitikra yoyde v'sois. We say what? We imagine that the end of every, it's called pitikra is the same thing as the thing we learned before called good asik. Good asik. The good means you drag it down. Asik. How good is you drag it, and asik you pull it down. And when do we say good asik? When we say pitikra, we say that the edge of the roof, we imagine that it comes right down. And
asik is going up. Achis is going down.
Actually, you're right. Sorry, you're 100% right. Good achis, to pulling it down. So therefore, we'll say over here good achis as if it's pulling it down, and that which is the same thing as pitikra, and therefore you have walls. So everything is all right. Okay, yeah. So the Gemara and Rabbi says psula below. We do not say pitikra yoyde v'seisim. We don't say pitikra yoyde v'seisim. So therefore, we say that there's no, we don't consider it as if the sukkah is surrounded by walls, as the Gemara will explain. So the Gemara, let's understand what's going on here. According to you, the Amrit, you say Pi tikra yoyed v'seisim, you believe in this concept of pi tikra yoyed v'seisim. Then if so, is afilu hifchiz doifenim tzoi. Even let's say that your sukkah is right in the middle, and you have schach boards that are, let's say, that less than 4 tefachim, and you have 2 walls, 2 parallel walls, and the 3rd wall collapsed. And you have all you have is 2 walls, which I said before is not good enough. According to you, we should apply the rule of pitikra and say pitikra yoyed v'seisim. I feel the middle wall is missing. Why did we say pitikra yoyed v'seisim? Amalei, he said to him, we say pitikra yoyed v'seisim, even though we said before that having a goat going underneath doesn't disturb us. But if we have it totally open, you have 2 parallel walls and it's open on both ends, it's called a maveh foolish, a street that's open on both ends, and people are going to use it all the time to walk through. It's very difficult to looks like a mockery if we're going to have an imaginary wall that everybody walks right through it. Can't have it. I concede to you that the havlik maveh foolish. This is treated like a street that's open on both ends. And it's made for the public to use. So you can't then 3 of us say, "Oh, but guys, don't you know there's an imaginary wall there?" So there's no particular in such a case we have such walls. So the Gemara, let us say this argument of Abaye of whether you say particular or not. Abaye says you do say particular, and And Rabbi says you don't. Now Rashi takes a big argument Halulim Shat, but Rashi learns here in Edom and in many places that the argument is that everyone agrees in the concept of pitikra if you're only doing it on one wall or two walls, but to say it on four sides, we don't say pitikra yedivaseisim, and the Abaye holds even on four sides you say pitikra yedivaseisim. So let's say they're arguing in a very similar case of Rav and Shmuel. The very same argument of Rav and Shmuel. Didn't we learn? Aksadr bika. You have a porch, but a bika out in the fields. There's no walls around it. It's open on all four sides. It's open on all four sides. Rav says mutter letaltul l'kuli. You're allowed to carry inside that porch, regardless how big it is, like a gazebo. You're allowed to carry inside it. Why? Because we'll say pitikri yevaseisim. That the edges of the roof come down on all four sides. So Rav holds even on four sides will apply the rule of pitikri yevaseisim. However, Rav mutter letaltul l'kuli. That means we say pitikri yevaseisim. We imagine a pitikri yevaseisim. Shmuel says no. We will not say pitikra if you need to make pitikra on all four sides. If you have a few existing walls and you want to add, then we can do it. But to create walls that are without no walls at all, I won't say pitikra. That's how Rashi learns. Taisel is exactly the opposite. That they're talking about that according to not talking about the fourth wall. They're arguing about the first wall and the second wall. But if you have 2-3 walls, everyone agrees you can make pitikra then. Anyway, so what do we think? Rab holds a pitikra and Shmuel does not hold a pitikra. So therefore, Abaye holds pitikra will hold like Rab, and Rabba, who says you don't say pitikra, will hold like Shmuel. That's what it appears. Says it's clear that Abaye cannot agree with Shmuel. Shmuel says there's no pitikra in the case of the porch, but Abaye is saying that a sukkah, we will say pitikra. So obviously, Abaye cannot hold like Shmuel. A little bit of Shmuel Kulam, there's definitely no discussion regarding Shmuel. About that Abaye definitely cannot agree with Shmuel. Abaye hold like Lav, but in the Rav itself, Lav Dafka, we have to say that Rav holds like Abaye. We can say that Rava, who argues that by Sukkah, we will not two parallel walls. We're not going to imagine pitikra on the other wall. Can also agree with Rav by Shabbat. How? Completely leave it up. Abaye holds like Rav. Rava say no. At Kanleg on Rav Hosam. You know why Rav says over there. You know why Rav over there by Shabbos says pitikra the mechitzas like Sadre who David. He says that roof that's sitting on top of the sukkah, that roof which is sitting on top of the sukkah is there for. It was made for that porch, for the gazebo. Therefore, we'll say, you know what? We're going to imagine the edges of that roof is going to come down. Okay, imagine our walls there, and therefore you let it carry. But what about when it comes to the case of the chutzah, the sukkah, let's say in the courtyard? In the sukkah in the courtyard, which roof are we using is pitikra? Not the schach. We're using the roofs of the veranda. But the roofs of the veranda are not there for the sukkah. They're there for the house. They're there for the veranda. So who says that you can say pitikra? Imagine there's a wall for something for outside of it. If you have a real wall, let's say a wall of a house, it's a full wall. We don't have to do any imagination. We'll say even though the walls of the house are built for the house, we can also use those walls as the walls for the sukkah. But if you're going to use an imaginary wall and you're going to use a roof that, let's say, the roof extends downwards, since the roof is not made for the sukkah, the roof is made for the house, we're not going to apply the rule of pitikra. But in the case of Shabbos, you have a gazebo out in the middle of nowhere, and you're using the roof and the lips of that roof on top of the gazebo, then we can do that because that roof is made for the gazebo. So we'll then say it's an imaginary wall. So he says here, so was it? You know why Rav over there says we have imaginary wall pitikra mechitza like Sada David. Maybe halachah l'mishusina who taught us that a pitikra and good achis is only where the roof is meant for that particular place. So then we'll extend it downwards. Here, the roof that you want to use is meant to be for the house, not for the sukkah. Who says you say pitikra? Like it doesn't work. Says the Gemara Tanan. Let's ask a question. On Abaye, it says in our Mishnah, it says clearly in our Mishnah, right? You have a courtyard that is surrounded by all of these porches. We make a difference if it's 4 amos or not 4 amos. According to Abaye, who cares if it's 4 amos? Even if it's further than 4 amos, so you cannot use the walls of the house. But let's say pitikra. Why don't we say that the edges of the roof is pitikra and that's it? By my name, but let us say pitikra. Let us say according to Abaye that the edges of the veranda, the roof of the veranda, comes down. There's your wall. Who cares We don't need the walls of the house. We could use the imaginary walls of the end of the veranda. According to Abaye, it's good enough. Says Gemara, Rava defends Abaye. This is the beautiful thing in the Gemara, that here they're having an argument, and he rejected the other person's argument. Instead of walking away saying, I won, he tries to find ways to defend his friend, so they continue to argue until they sort out the truth. Because all they interested was the pursuit of truth. So Rava then, when we have a number of times, Rava went ahead and defended Abaye Kishehisha as Kiruya. It's talking about a case if the other roof is flush with your roof, so therefore there's no pitikra. You can't. It's not. If you're sitting in the sukkah, you won't see the pitikra. They're on the same level, and they're contiguous, touching each other. So then there is no pitikra. That's why in the case of the Mishnah we cannot apply the rule of pitikra. There is no pi. You cannot see it. Says the Gemara, Besura Masnal Shmaita B'Halishna. This is how they learned the Gemara in Surah. Very similar we learned yesterday. But in Pumbedisa, they learned a little bit different. Masni, they learned Sichich Agabi Exadra. If he makes chach on a porch, ain't no psimin, there's no psimin. The way I told you, Rafi learned that the psimin are within 3 tvachim of each other. The Shem have a hard time. Who needs pitikra? You have your walls right there. You have your walls. You have lavud. What's the pitikra? So they learn ptzimin means on the edges of the 4 corners you have ptzimin, nothing more than that. But here the Mishnah says if you have, let's say, a porch without any ptzimin, divrei hakol psul, everyone holds that it's possible. Everyone holds it's possible, right? Because there's no walls. Let's use pitikra. What's the big deal? Let's say you have no tzimon, use tikra. But since the tikra of the porches are meant for the house and not for the sukkah, everyone agrees we don't say tikra in a case where you're using the roof that's not part of the area that you want to close, or something else, and then your imaginary walls. Like Rava said before, now we're saying that goes according to everybody. So what? Yeshla ptzimin, where they argue if there were ptzimin. Abaye says Ksheira. Abaye says kosher. Or is it possible? Abaye says Ksheira. We say love it. Yeah. And this is how why Rashi wants to learn that there is all the 3 talking to each other. Because we say love it. And Rava says Psula. I mean love it. You don't say Rava says you don't say love it. You don't say love it. And the chiddush of Abaye that you do say love it is that even though these psimin were not meant for the sukkah, they were meant for the porch. Nevertheless, I will use them and say love it. And Rava says that apostle. Why were they apostle? Because Rava said, look, that these mechitzas, these posts were not made for the sukkah. Had the posts been inside the sukkah, then of course I would agree with you, we'll say love it. But because the posts are part of the veranda, therefore I won't say love it. I won't use that as a mechitza. That's what he's saying, yeah. The Hilchasa and Allah is Kalish Nekama. The Allah is like the first Lashon. Not that this way everyone agrees to say love it. Allah is like the first Lashon, and that the argument of Bayrav is whether you say particular in the case where they're using the roof of another area with an imaginary wall. That's when, and the halacha is like Rava. So everyone agrees when it comes to lavud, we'll say lavud, even though the posts are meant for something else. Since they're now going to be part of the sukkah, we can use them for the sukkah. The question is about pitikra. We're using the roof outside the sukkah. Can you also say pitikra on that? And the halacha is like Rava. Rav Ashi of Kahana, he once found of Kahana the komisachir that was placed in schach al gabi aksadra she'ein lo ptzimin. He was placed in schach on aksadra that had no ptzimin whatsoever. And Omalei, in other words, it had two walls, and the third wall, what do you call it? He was relying on on this next to Exadra, and he did not do the method we learned of Zion that you have to have a Tzuras Pesach, or you have to have a tefach minimum, and so on. He didn't do any of that. He just saw two walls. And then he saw there was a next to a veranda. He said to him, if this psimin is kosher, but there's no psimin possible, we're not going to do pitikra, we're not going to use the roof of the veranda to imagine that you have a third wall. So where's your third wall? Achvele, he showed him the following. And actually, we have a picture here in the Gemara. He showed him, Nira mebifnim, if it's seen from the inside. Interesting who made these diagrams in the Gemara or Rashi. I mean, you would think it's a printer. But I saw yesterday, the Ran writes, there's a picture in the Rif of the Gemara we learned yesterday, and the Ran writes that the Rif made that picture. In his writings, he drew that picture. which is very similar to what we're looking right here. So I'm wondering who actually did, if any of these pictures that we see in Rashi were actually made by Rashi, because the Ran says the Rif drew the picture, which looks very similar to here. Anyway, Nida mebefnim, v'shava mebechutz. If you have a lechi, or inami, Nida mechutz v'shava mebefnim. If you look at the picture here, if you're sitting inside the sukkah, right, you don't see the third wall. But if you're sitting inside the porch, you'll see suddenly that it is abutting the second wall, there's a tefach sticking, but not inside the sukkah, it's outside the sukkah. And now, why is that good? Because we learned in Erevin, even we learned by Erevin, if you have three walls on the street, and then, what do you call it? You have three walls on the street, and then we need to make a lechi, so that people, either because it serves as a wall or a hecker reminder, people realize the street ends over here, and now you're about to spill out into the Rosh Hashanah, to the main street. So what happens if you have a lechi that it cannot be visible to the people in the street? So we learned there's a few ways. Either you extend the street. Let's say your street is three walls. You extend on one of those three walls out into the street another bit, and that's your lechi. And the other side you don't extend, so people can realize it's not part of the wall. It's a lechi, or it's facing the other way, not into the mavli, but the other way, and that's good enough. Neither but the chutz, if the lechi can be seen on the outside, the shav b'fnim, but inside it looks like part of the wall. Neither mishum lechi, we'll treat it as a lechi. We'll treat it as a lechi. So therefore, the hainu p'tzimin, and that's the case of p'tzimin. That's you want to know where the third wall is? That's a third wall here. Tais at the top of the page says he doesn't understand the Gemara. Look, let's learn the Taisus here, just the top Taisus. So what do we say? Just like it works for everyone, it works for here. It says Taisus, Tema, I don't understand. Hey, yichumoyel b'sukkah. How in the world you're sitting inside the sukkah? You don't see the third wall, that that tefach, because it's abutting the second wall, but it's extended outside. And we're saying it's good enough because by Mav it's good enough. How do we sukkah? Since sitting inside the sukkah, you don't see it. Shlishi shel tefach, you don't see the third wall of a tefach. How's it work? The imishum miga, if you're going to tell me that since it works for Shabbos, and we had the Zayin over this, it works for Shabbos, it works also for Sukkah, or vice versa. The imishum miga, chad, first of all, the autumn mila of kind of Sukkah ela Shabbos. Are we talking here about Shabbos? Or we're talking about the whole Sukkahs? If we're talking about only the day of Shabbos, okay, then you'll tell me, since for Shabbos today, it's good enough for Erev, so therefore it's also good enough for Sukkah. But we're not talking about Shabbos, we're talking about Sukkah generally. Tesa holds that Migi only helps for dinim d'Rabbanan, not for dinim of the Torah. Having a third wall is a din in the Torah. It's not like an Erev, which is only with the Rabbanan, because for the Torah, three walls is sufficient to turn into Shasa Yachid. So how can the Gemara say over here that it works? And Tesa remains with a question. He doesn't understand.
So to get to understand this picture here, when you're standing in the area of the sukkah and you're looking towards the Achsadra, what you can see is one wall behind you, one wall on your side, and then you see the Achsadra. So where do you get the third wall here? At the bottom of the Achsadra?
No, if you look at the picture of the Gemara.
Yeah.
So you see the picture of the Gemara.
So you're standing in the area that's the sukkah, that's labeled as the sukkah, right?
Yeah. So if you
finish looking that towards wall, the Achsadra,
you finish that wall that abuts the beginning of the Chsadra, you see that there's a little, like an L.
Yeah, it was on top of the Aleph.
It looks like a big base. So it's like the bottom, like the base that sticks out. That sticks out is your lechi, or is your third wall. But it's facing outside of the sukkah, not inside the sukkah. So when you're seeing the sukkah, you just see two walls. The walls are behind you, inside of you, and then you see the Chsadra. You don't see that third wall, that tefach, because it's going outside. It's forming, it's a wall because it forms part of the Chsadra there, but you don't see it inside the sukkah. But
and
because it's good enough for Erev, it's good enough for sukkah as well. So Tesa doesn't understand. Why would it be good enough?
I was looking at the diagram differently. I was looking at the wall on the left, which extends a little bit into the area called sukkah.
No, that's not what it is.
No,
it's not that. It's look at the end of the wall on your.
You mean along next to the hay of Achsadra?
Yeah. That wall I thought extends into the sukkah area a little bit.
Take the aleph of Achsadra, and on the right side of that, that's the third wall, and up and right. Looks like a base. A base that sticks out. That's what it is. Okay. We'll continue tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem.